Across our planet, abandoned cities and apocalyptic dead zones hide in plain view. Boom towns, where the boom went bust. Industrial powerhouses, deserted and decaying. Once prosperous cities, now too toxic for human life. This is a glimpse of what the future might hold for those places we call home. These two towns are sobering reminders that there are no safe havens in our unpredictable world. One, the site of a nuclear nightmare. The other, poisoned by the industry that gave it life. Pripyat, Oklahoma, and Pripyat, Ukraine. Two ghost towns on our forgotten planet. Pripyat is frozen in time. An eerie silence prevails over the chilly Ukrainian city, which was once part of the former Soviet Union. Down every street and corridor, life seems to have been put on hold. The hotel stands empty. Athletes no longer practice high dives or swim freestyle in the indoor pool. At the amusement park, the big wheel stands waiting for customers that will never arrive. In this classroom, unfinished homework remains strewn across the desks of children who were whisked away. In a nearby school cafeteria, gas masks litter the floor. They point to a disturbing story of what happened to the people who once lived here.
Why could such a nice town be left forever empty, without people? Why? Why did it happen to our town, of all towns? It was such a beautiful town, full of flowers, full of roses. We thought it was so unfair.
Pripyat was a planned community developed in the 1970s to house the workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and their families. With a population of over 45,000, it was considered one of the best places to live in the Soviet Union.
Была прекрасная жизнь.
We had a good life. We had good jobs. We had good times. Every weekend, every public holiday, we met our friends. The fondest memory that I share with my husband is that our son was born here.
На шашлыки.
The Bela Krajinskis moved to Pripyat for work and to raise a family. But 25 years ago, their worst nightmare came to life. April the 25th, 1986, began like any other spring day. Shops opened up for business. Children headed off to school. But most of the residents piled into cars and buses for the less than 4-kilometer commute to the Chernobyl plant. This is reactor number 4. It was once capable of producing 10% of the electricity for what is now the Ukraine, until everything went terribly and horribly wrong. The following morning, in the pre-dawn hours of April the 26th, a system test was performed to determine the power generated during an electrical loss. Operator errors and bungled decision-making led to the rupture of fuel elements, triggering a runaway nuclear reaction. Inside the plant, workers watched in horror as reactor number 4 exploded, blasting off the roof and ejecting 100 types of radioactive material almost 1.6 kilometers into the atmosphere. 2 men were killed in the explosion, the first fatalities in a slowly unfolding disaster. Immediately following the blast, a fire broke out, releasing a second deadly plume of radiation into the surrounding area. At the time of the accident, the residents of Pripyat awoke to a deafening bang. The first people who rushed to the scene were also the first to fall ill. Workers and firefighters suffered extreme vomiting, diarrhea and burns as the radioactive material penetrated their skin and organs. 28 of them would also perish within months of the blast from acute radiation poisoning.
During the first minute and the first hours of explosion, the radiation was very high, and what is much more important, it was very high for the breathing, for inhalation. And this was very, very dangerous.
Within hours of the disaster, Ludmila Belakrajinsky, who worked in Chernobyl's sanitation inspection room, got an urgent call to provide emergency clothing for power plant workers and firefighters.
They did not say right away about the serious scale of the disaster. But when we came to work, we could see for ourselves that it was a large explosion at reactor number 4.
What the workers couldn't possibly see was the horrific extent of the radioactive nightmare the explosion had unleashed.
The amount of radiation that was released from Chernobyl was about 400 times the amount of radiation that took place in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined.
Research scientist Eric Howell has been studying the effects of the radiation released from the Chernobyl disaster.
The amount of force that was produced by both the steam explosion and the graphite fire threw radiation into the atmosphere, and the wind currents that day blew a highly concentrated plume to the west and a subsequent plume to the north over the city of Pripyat. We use this modern radiation detector to characterize these plumes, and it will tell us both the radiation levels and the specific radioisotopes found at each location. The current radiation level is 24 microsieverts per hour, which is much higher than the levels we receive in the United States, and may cause significant health effects if experienced for long periods of time.
Pripyat was in the immediate path of the nuclear fallout. This amusement park was scheduled to open just 5 days after the disaster. It was situated in one of the most radiated areas of the city. At the time of the explosion, radiation levels were reported to be at least 100,000 times greater than normal. At that exposure, people would have died within 2 or 3 months.
We're here at the carnival grounds in Pripyat, the location where the May Day celebration was set to open 5 days after Reactor 4 of Chernobyl blew. The initial radiation moved over the eastern side of this city. Radiation levels were high enough to deem this city uninhabitable.
Throughout Pripyat are vestiges of the former Soviet Union, reminders of the cloak of secrecy and denial. During the first 24 hours, the communist government tried to cover up the accident. Residents went about the day, families went for strolls, and young people soaked up the spring sun, unaware of the radioactive debris that drifted over the city. At this nursery school, dozens of children took naps in these beds and played with toys now coated with dust, while radioactive iodine, particularly harmful to a child's thyroid, drifted in through open windows. At restaurants, chefs prepared meals for their hungry patrons, not knowing the food may have been contaminated. But as the day progressed, some citizens began coughing, vomiting, and complaining of a strange taste in their mouths, all symptoms of radiation sickness.
У меня лично
I remember it and sometimes feel it even now. It was a taste like rotten straw burning. I did have a headache. I was dizzy.
As strong winds began to blow the radioactive cloud across Russia and into Europe, the Soviets quietly hatched a plan to empty Pripyat of all its people. In the radioactive ghost town of Pripyat, reminders of the days after the Chernobyl disaster are still visible everywhere. These Soviet-era dwellings reverberate with abandonment. A pair of shoes left behind. Windows and doors ajar. Cherished dolls have been cast aside. Musty books blanket the floors of schools and libraries. The weathered pages symbolize the dark chapter in the lives of the people who were uprooted.
Our memories of Pripyat are very sad. Every person who lived there who had to suffer this, it is very hard. One cannot express it in words.
But the event was far from normal. 36 hours after the explosion, this deserted plaza became the scene of a citywide evacuation. The Soviet government didn't provide a clear reason for the sudden departure. Officials explained the move was temporary, probably to prevent hysteria and hasten the process. On April the 28th, 2 days after the explosion, the radioactive plume had traveled over 1,500 kilometers and set off alarms at a nuclear plant in Sweden. The truth about the accident had now been exposed.
It wasn't until radiation workers at the Forsmark nuclear facility in Sweden found increased levels of radiation on their clothes, that a nuclear accident had been brought into question. A few days later, the Soviets then admitted that there had been a nuclear accident at Chernobyl.
In the following weeks, the shocking news was broadcast all over the world.
На Чернобыльской атомной электростанции произошла авария. Поврежден один из атомных реакторов.
By this time, nearly 200,000 people had been evacuated from the villages and towns surrounding the Chernobyl plant.
Услышав это о том, что
It was scary when we heard that we could never come back.
города Припять, конечно,
Of course, it was a great pity that we had to leave all our belongings.
была первая мысль о том, что у нас
But our first thought was about our child, and we simply could not take those belongings with us anyway because they were all contaminated.
и мы даже об этом даже не пожалели.
A quarter of a century after nuclear disaster, it's still unsafe for people to live here. But nature exploits the absence of humans. Wind, rain, and snow gain entry through broken windows, turning once orderly homes into chaos. Borne by the winds and carried by birds, seeds find their way into cracks, sprouting into trees. Abandoned homes are as welcoming as any forest.
When we saw what the town had turned into, I was so sad. I was so sorry that we just had to abandon our homes. I felt as if we had betrayed this place and left it, abandoned it.
Former residents are occasionally granted brief visits to their dead city. Valyera and Ludmila Belakrajinsky have returned with their son Ruslan, who was only 7 at the time of the disaster. They tour their old home that's been scarred by weather and vandalized by looters who stole precious furniture and other possessions.
Состояние, конечно, сердце
Of
болит,
course, my heart aches when I see the place.
слезы на глазах. Сразу
I get tears in my eyes.
та жизнь,
I start remembering the life we had before the accident.
куда ни повернешь, все тебе знакомо.
Whichever way you turn, everything looks so familiar.
Твои вроде бы родные.
When my mom asked me to come with them to Pripyat, I think it was maybe I afraid to come here, not because it can be dangerous for us. Maybe because I didn't want to remember about it.
Ему больно.
We could see how painful it was for him. He had not expected to see the town where he had spent his childhood. We could see sadness in his eyes.
I really don't know what I'm feeling right now. I don't know. Maybe later when I will go back to Kiev and in the car I will think about it. But now I can't say what I'm feeling.
Today, the vacant city of Pripyat looks like a sinister backdrop for a horror film. Ragged curtains and other debris flutter as winds whip through broken windows and over fallen down doors. The natural and man-made carnage stirs emotions. Graffiti now taunts the walls of buildings. Many images are of children, reminders of those stripped of their youth. But burning or tearing down structures will only release more radiation into the air. So Pripyat waits.
This place was once a place where people would meet and socialize, and now it's quiet and barren. The radiation levels that are found here now will take a couple hundred years to dissipate back to what they were before the Chernobyl disaster.
For nearly 25 years, Pripyat has been sealed off from the world, contained within a 30-kilometer exclusion zone that stretches around the perimeter of the exploded reactor. A crucifix stands guard at the entrance to the forsaken city, a memorial to those whose lives were destroyed. In the Ukraine and around the world, the extent of the lingering health effects of the Chernobyl disaster remains controversial. Unofficial reports estimate that hundreds of thousands of people have been affected by various illnesses due to the radioactive fallout that dispersed over almost 250,000 square kilometers. Many of the studies acknowledge a spike in cancers among over 500,000 liquidators, the name given to those who assisted in the post-disaster cleanup.
Вы знаете,
Up until the disaster, I'd never taken a single day of sick leave. Then, after I spent 3 years working there at the Chernobyl plant, they pulled me from the exclusion zone for health reasons. I had cancer surgery. Twice.
Along with physical diseases, the psychological effects of a nuclear disaster and the evacuation have been equally debilitating.
For people of Pripyat, you understand that, okay, first minutes and first hours and first 2 days or maybe 36 hours, it was very dangerous. But they feel bad psychologically because they are out of their building, out of their apartment, and sometimes without their friends.
From the rooftops of Pripyat, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant looms in the distance. It's a chilling reminder that the catastrophe is far from over for the 45,000 displaced people of this once vibrant city. But Pripyat is not the only contaminated ghost town where residents have been afflicted with physical and emotional trauma. 25 years after Chernobyl, and thousands of kilometers away, another kind of disaster forced the evacuation of the most toxic town in America. This could be any small town in America, once vital and prosperous, and now doomed by the very industry that built it. Pitcher, Oklahoma, is no longer a perfect image of American life. Along Main Street, businesses are boarded up. At the rusting diner, it's no longer service with a smile. Silence fills the local bar where friends once unwound after a long day. At this garage, the only thing in need of repair is the building itself. In home after home, discarded photographs and other personal possessions are sobering reminders of the people who were uprooted.
I think like a lot of small towns, the people of Pitcher were very proud of where they came from. They had raised their families here. They had worked very hard. These were salt-of-the-earth folks. They had pride in that community, and they hated to see it go.
Pitcher, Oklahoma, is now a toxic wasteland, complete with sinking streets, polluted water, and immense mounds of contaminated gravel.
The irony is that we loved our town and it helped us survive, but in the end it was what was bad for us. It hurt us and made us ill.
Pitcher's road to ruin began at the turn of the 20th century. In 1913, the discovery of lead and zinc ore sparked a mining frenzy in northeastern Oklahoma. This was in the heart of Quapaw Indian Territory, reservation land allotted to the tribe by the U.S. federal government.
Where we're standing right now, this was my grandmother's 40 acres, one of her 40-acre shares. And they were allotted this land by the federal government for us to live on.
The Bureau of Indian Affairs eventually leased out tribal land to dozens of mining companies. It would be a blessing and a curse. Today, here's what's left of the mining structures. Crumbling walls of brick and concrete. They resemble the remains of some lost civilization.
Like a lot of mining communities, the community of Pitcher grew up around the mines. So the homes of the miners, the businesses, the government offices all existed above the underground workings.
The Hatfields had lived in Pitcher and its sister city, Cardin, for generations. For them, mining was a big part of everyday life.
My dad was a miner and my granddad was a miner. I remember the big horn that they blowed when a miner would be hurt underground, and everybody would run to the mines to see if it was their dad or their loved one.
Pitcher was the largest producer of lead and zinc in the world. Its mines supplied the ore used to make bullets for the First and Second World Wars.
People of Pitcher, people of the mining communities, are proud to say that their families mined the lead and zinc that won the First and Second World War. And it's true, they did.
These dilapidated buildings are the ramshackle reminders of the town's robust past. During its heyday, some were once bars and cinemas that entertained the work-weary miners who spent their days toiling in the tunnels beneath the city. But like all booms, this one eventually went bust. By the 1970s, ore prices had decreased and the mining waned. The population dipped to under 2,500. Thousands left town to find other work. Pitcher lost its cash cow, and at the same time, it inherited an environmental nightmare.
The mining that produced the prosperity for a community like Pitcher also left certain environmental liabilities. So there are the contamination liabilities from the waste materials that are left on the surface, from the contaminated water that was produced from the underground workings, from the contaminated soils as those materials were moved across the landscape.
Today, pale grey mountains surround the abandoned city. At first glance, they look like naturally sculpted sand dunes. But they're actually mounds of lead-contaminated gravel called chat.
It's one of the large chat piles here in the Pitcher mining field. These are the remnants of the mining operations. Once the ore was brought to the surface and processed, the remaining material were placed in these large piles onto the surface. It's contaminated with elevated concentrations of lead, zinc, and cadmium. You can see that it's also been wind eroded to a certain degree, and that material has begun to move off-site.
Today, an estimated 50 million tons of chat loom over Pitcher. Some mounds reach 60 meters high. For decades, these seemingly majestic piles of grit defined the city.
We climbed on the chat piles and slid down on cardboard pieces, and we had fun and played around the chat piles. We didn't know there was any harm in those chats.
But the chat was silently killing the town. Prairie winds whipped up the leaded dust and blew it through the streets, covering everything with a blanket of toxic film.
There would be dust collected on the furniture, which was from the chat piles. It was always an ongoing battle that we had to dust our house and clean our house.
Residents even used the metal-laden substance to fill school sandboxes, alleyways, and yards.
We're standing in a ballpark, or at least it used to be a ballpark. Most of this ground was chat. All of the parking lot, the benches, there were benches up here where people sat. They were sitting on chat. And then the wind was blowing chat all around. And I just really thought this was a hazard for our children.
The chat piles were just one of the dangers facing the people of Pitcher. Here is Tar Creek, which flows through the town. Its burnt orange-stained waters tell the grim tale of what mining did to this once picturesque town.
The underground mining actually occurred in the Boone Aquifer, which held stored water and was actually used as a drinking water source for a lot of the local communities. So during the decades of mining, many pumps ran and pumped millions of gallons a day of water from the Boone Aquifer to allow the mining to proceed. Over time, as those mines were abandoned, those pumps were shut off, allowing the entire mine pool, the entire mine workings to fill with groundwater. That water's contaminated. Unfortunately, those waters flow out of the ground, they work their way down into the local streams and result in significant environmental contamination of Tar Creek and many of the smaller tributaries.
It's turned a real bad red color, and of course you knew something was wrong with that horrible looking color to it.
In the 1980s, the federal government established the Superfund, an organization to clean up sites contaminated with hazardous waste. Of the 1,300 Superfund sites across the US, Pitcher was first on the list. But the damage had already been done. In the 1990s, 1 in 4 of the children tested in Pitcher had blood lead levels 2.5 times above the threshold for safety. Teachers reported lower IQ levels and learning disabilities.
The primary risk pathway for exposure to that material is through the ingestion pathway. Children exposed to chat, typically in soil, can get that material into their digestive system, which then leads into a contamination of the bloodstream.
We knew my son Chad had problems all the way through school because he just struggled with his grades. Then after that, you know, Chad couldn't hold a job. His nerves were too damaged, and we had neuropsychologists check him, and they said Chad was lead affected.
We climbed chat piles, big ones, and went and found big ponds out by chat piles and fished in them and stuff. I didn't have any idea I would have a nerve condition from being out there like that, or lead contamination, or that it was making me not learn as good or anything like that.
In 2004, the federal government offered a buyout program to families with children 6 years old and younger, the ones most susceptible to the effects of lead poisoning. Hundreds of families took the cash and fled. Mining pollution wasn't the only thing driving out residents. These massive sinkholes have swallowed streets, businesses, and homes. In 2006, US Army engineers determined that much of Pitcher was now in danger of caving in because the cavernous underground mines had been dug too close to the surface.
Some of the miners will tell you that they could see tree roots from the top of the mines when they were inside, and that they mined too close to the surface.
There certainly have been documented cases from a few decades ago of very rapid collapses occurring, literally overnight collapses where entire homes fell into holes into the ground tens of feet below the surface.
We had a big backyard, and in the very back lot, which was fenced off, there was a mine shaft back there, an open mine shaft. And they said that was the reason that they would buy us out first, that we were very much in harm's way.
In 2006, Pitcher was declared a danger zone. Rumors of a citywide evacuation hung in the air. Still, many residents clung to their stricken community until a different kind of disaster sealed the town's fate. Here, in the poisoned town of Pitcher in Oklahoma, the contaminated leftovers from a half-century of mining exist almost everywhere you look. They're in the air, soil, and water. In 2006, the US federal government offered a total buyout program to relocate all of the remaining inhabitants.
I believe that my husband and my son both were affected by the lead that was in the air in this town. Bob has chronic bronchitis and has cancer that's affecting him now.
I had thyroid cancer about 9 years ago. We took the thyroid out, and it reoccurred about a year ago, causing me to lose my vocal cord. But couldn't escape it.
This area was once a neighborhood where residents mowed lawns and children biked along the sleepy streets. But on May the 10th, 2008, a tornado struck near the Kansas-Oklahoma border. The twister's 280-kilometer-per-hour winds slammed into Pitcher. 8 residents were killed, 150 were injured, and huge areas of the city were leveled. It was the most violent tornado Oklahoma had seen in almost a decade.
The real final slap in the face was after that buyout had begun in May of 2008. Pitcher was hit by a large F4 tornado, which took about a third of the town. That exacerbated the buyout, kind of accelerated things.
The government did not provide aid to rebuild over 100 homes destroyed by the tornado because of the pre-existing toxic threat. However, the buyout program continued.
I didn't really want to leave when I was a young man. I loved it here. I grew to know the hazard and wanted to leave, but couldn't.
By September 2009, the school district had dissolved and the city government shut down. Most of the remaining residents accepted government funding to permanently relocate, even though many weren't fully compensated for the value of their homes.
I do sympathize with them. Those were their homes. There was people that lived over there their entire lives that were uprooted and have to go somewhere else.
Pitcher is now a ghost town. 80% of the town and surrounding area has been given back to the Quapaw Indians. In a sad and ironic twist of fate, the tribe has since taken over some of the cleanup effort. It's estimated that this will take decades, if not longer.
I just hope everybody takes a good look around and see what kind of devastation, what kind of mess. I mean, as far as you can see over here, you know, in all directions, this is what we have, and it's unfair.
In an overpopulated, industrialized world, millions of people are forced to live in the shadow of factories, power stations, and mining facilities. So what happened to Pitcher, Oklahoma, and Pripyat, Ukraine, could happen anywhere in the world. Man-made disasters forced out their populations. Neither place will ever be habitable again. Standing as remnants of the runaway industrial age, these towns signal a warning to our modern world. A disturbing look into a possible future on our forgotten planet.